Topics in this final chapter 10 Part 1. Inaugurated as governor. First message. Warning letter from Charles O'Connor. Special message relating to the canals. Canal investigating commissions. Vetoes William Cullen Bryant. Municipal reform message. Official protest against the interference of United States troops with the legislation of Louisiana. Vacation tour through the Canal counties. Receives the degree of Doctor of Laws from Yale College. Habits of labor. Second annual message. Utica Convention. Fifth Avenue Conference. Tilden's views of civil service reform. Nominated for the presidency. Tilden's reform platform. Mr. Tilden brought to his exalted position a measure of professional training, of political and financial experience, and practical knowledge of men, whether in mass or detail, which had never before been combined in an equal degree in any chief magistrate of the Empire State. His life seemed to have been a preparation for the work to which he had been called. In his youth he had learned from the struggles of the Democratic Party with the United States Bank the folly of an unsecured paper currency as the basis of industrial and commercial exchanges, and the demoralizing influence upon society of the reckless system of credits to which it gives birth. During a period of more than 50 years he had lived in constant and familiar intercourse with the ruling men of the country, and enjoyed opportunities of appreciating its varying political situations during that long period under every advantage, and of appropriating their lessons. Though much of that time in a position which entitled him to his choice of the public honors of the country, he was never an office holder, nor the solicitor for himself of any official position at the hands of a political patron. During his 20 years' hard service at the bar he had established a reputation in his chosen department of the profession to which it will not be undue praise to say that no other man in the United States could make pretension. Though often deploring its measures, he had adhered to the Democratic Party from a conviction that his power for usefulness to the country was greater inside than outside of that organization. The legislature, which shared with Governor Tilden the responsibilities of the state government in 1875, was divided politically. The Republicans had the ascendancy in the Senate, the Democrats in the Assembly. It was apparent, therefore, that strictly party measures would have small chance of success, while the enlarged powers conferred upon the governor by the amended Constitution of vetoing the separate items of appropriation bills made him ultimately responsible for any extravagance in legislation. He had been nominated and elected as the prophet and apostle of reform. With a divided legislature and a hostile administration at Washington, how would he make good his pledges? How to realize the hopes and expectations of his men, whose interests were to be prejudiced or improved by his recommendations? What defections from his following were to be apprehended? What new political alliances were to be anticipated? Was he to prove a statesman, or only a partisan politician? If the former, would he succeed or fail? These were some of the questions which had been the subjects of infinite speculation during the interval between his election and his inauguration, and which lent an unusual interest to his first official message to the legislature. That interest was increased rather than diminished by its publication. It produced a profound impression, not only within, but beyond, the boundaries of the state. The Senate consisted of 18 Republicans, 12 Democrats, and 2 Independents. The Assembly, of 73 Democrats, 53 Republicans, and 2 Independents. It was unquestionably the ablest and most statesmanlike communication that had ever been addressed to the legislature of the state of New York, as it was, I believe, the first one that was extensively copied by the press of other states. And it was foreshadowed with distinctness the controlling features of his administration. First, reform in the administration. Second, the restoration of the financial principles which triumphed in the election of Jackson and Van Buren, and left the country for the first time in its history without $1 of indebtedness, and with unrivaled credit. Third, the cheerful and unconditional acceptance of the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments of the Federal Constitution. In furtherance of his policy of administrative reform, he recommended a revision of the laws intended to provide penal and civil remedies for frauds by public officers and their accomplices. These recommendations, during the same session carefully wrought into the legislation of the state, bore especially upon those forms of administrative abuse which the exposure and arrest of William M. Tweed had recently revealed, and also upon a kindred class of abuses in the management of our canals with which the governor was already acquainted, and which were soon to be the theme of what was destined to prove to him the most important communication ever made by him to the legislature. The governor received the following letter from his friend Charles O'Connor a few days after his inauguration. Fort Washington, January 4, 1875. My dear sir, all observers must have noticed that politicians out of power censure the practices of those who are in power, until they succeed in displacing the latter, and then, as the new officer takes the vacated scat of his rival, censure gives place to imitation. To power and place all public spirit tends. In power and place all public spirit tends. I do not mean to intimate any suspicion that this will be your course, but I cannot avoid apprehension that you may imagine the conflicts of your public life are to end with your assumption of your native state's chief magistracy. This is not probably the fact. You rose to power and real eminence on the topmost wave of a revolution which showed its political power very much, if not entirely, to yourself. The first Capolin, if not an author, was, like yourself, an organizer of revolution. He was too wise to consider his campaign ended with the attainment of an imperial crown. He knew the necessity of continuing them, and for the brief term of 11 years that he reigned over the greatest of modern continental nations, he was always in the saddle. Selfish ambition unfortunately controlled in the employment of his mighty intellectual forces, and the consequence is that his name remains a doubt on the page of history. Such as his has been the course of almost all military actors in revolutionary movements. They shed the blood of millions to renew the very fetters their own arms break through. Whether by positive action, or by being simply acquiescent, you will fail to sustain with your official powers the revolutionary reform that made you governor, is now the question of interest. If you do, the same poet above quoted will furnish opposite lines. One single step into the right had made this man the Washington of worlds betrayed. One single step unto the wrong hath given his name a doubt to all the winds of heaven. The desire for power whereby to practice official corruption is the only agent now active in political or official circles. This must continue until a strong-handed and perfectly fearless revolutionist with patriotic aims shall infuse a new spirit into the times. Your action in 1871 justified the belief that you might be the Redeemer. And if now, the first moment you ever had any official power, you are found to shrink into the mere conservator of our friends, I must commend to your reflection the lines last quoted. So much for generalities. I pass to particulars. The mayor's indictment, as originally framed, displays all the particulars needed to an inner view of the charnel house which you and I tried to purify. We failed in the effort merely because official power, wedded to villainy, was too strongly entrenched. Your election has turned these entrenchments, and your single gun has force enough from its position to rake their whole line and give the victory to assailed justice. The official letters between Smith and Vance on the 29th and 30th of December, 1874, and the joint letter of Porter and Curtis to Smith, dated January 1, 1875, complete the picture above alluded to. Agreeably to the policy indicated, treating me as resigned, Smith formally dismissed Peckham and Barlow, and the papers of January 1, 1875, contain the joint acceptance by Porter and Curtis of the retainer in their stead. These are the very gentlemen who gave to Smith's predecessor a written opinion, which you know was thrown in our teeth throughout the conflict. Footnote: Okie Hall, then mayor of New York, was indicted and tried before Judge Charles P. Daly. The result was a mistrial owing to the death of a juror. This opinion was to the effect that the suits which, upon the advice of Mr. O'Connor and his colleagues, had been brought by the Attorney General in the name of the state would not lie, and that the only actions which would lie, if any, would be those brought by the city and county by Mr. O'Gorman when corporation counsel, but which had not been proceeded with. End footnote. Not satisfied with arguing against the state's right of action, they expressed doubts, on page 10, whether any action could be maintained for the courthouse swindle. Whatever may have been your emotions on reaching the chair of state, Wickham has no conception beyond making a pleasant thing for himself and our friends out of the seat which he occupies. The millions which Barlow's austere integrity refused to accept as a compromise remains with the rogues, to be employed as a corruption fund. It cannot fail to be so employed, and without stern and vigorous opposition from you, it must be successful. The removal of Smith suits the taste of the powers here, because it gives them the patronage and facilities of that office. Of course that will be done. But I do not believe that the public will derive any benefit from it unless you interfere, and that very resolutely. Whom you name to me will make a worse officer than Smith, because he is vastly more able, and in no other respect better. The adjustment suggested in the World of January 4th is a bargain in harmony. Never showed us the slightest countenance. R., who I suppose is your journalist friend's choice, would be a mischievous donnothing it. He was so throughout the conflict. Though I would say nothing affirmatively to his disparagement, I would consider the public interests merely abandoned by his appointment. The other appointment would be a betrayal of them. No true leader of an honest out-and-out effort at reform could hesitate to decide that a democratic appointing power was bound to give the post to Peckham. But he who cannot do the best in an emergency, if reasonably sensible and intelligent, will generally have an alternative. O'Connor would in all human probability fill the place satisfactorily. His right-hand man, though a bigoted nigger-worshipping Republican, is among the few that are good one of the best. I care nothing personally about the mere individual interest of any among these suggested appointees. I argue for the cause. To it, however little I may actually do, I swear unalterable and untiring fidelity for that short space that may remain to me here. And that is the animus which inspires this letter. I take it for granted that any one among the aspirants to this profitable office will concede his entire patronage to the dictators of Tammany Hall, whoever they may be. You have more power over this matter than merely that of withholding your assent from the removal. That power, if it stood alone, might be insufficient. The governor may remove the mayor himself for cause. Laws of 1873, page 491. 1 Edmunds Statutes, page 11344. 6 Edmunds Statutes, page 789. You may suppose that no cause will be given. Green is the honest man whose firm resistance of the plunderers makes him the single official representative of the revolution inaugurated by you in 1871. Stimulated to it by the swindlers and their allies, the mayor is determined to remove Green, and his eggers-on will hardly let him sleep until he does the deed. In his fierce action toward this good official, coupled with certain surroundings, will be found ample cause. You doubtless wish to avoid a conflict of this sort. No one can censure the desire, but can you avoid it? On the other hand, are you prepared to express your official approval in writing, as required, when on false charges this single champion of the people's treasury is arbitrarily removed in order that a factionist or a manageable respectability may be appointed in his stead? I have no doubt but there will be a plot to purchase his resignation for this latter purpose. Footnote: O'Connor was not opposed to the removal of Smith, but anxious for a worthier successor. William C. Whitney succeeded Smith as corporation counsel. Doubtless Wheeler H. Peckham, Esquire, of the New York Bar, and footnote, purchase his resignation for this latter purpose. This will only prove all concerned to be self-seeking jugglers. It may be said that if the mayor were removed, his legal successor would be no better than himself. This might be all the better, for it would awaken a demand for reform from the legislature which could not be resisted. But an intimation to his honor that this power exists, and may be used if necessary, might meet the exigency. Perhaps it would render him compliant to the demands of justice and sound policy. The important steps are, first, to put this law department into honest and efficient hands. Second, to obtain precisely and broadly, as framed, the sections giving complete authority to the state in such cases. Your suggestion that this must, perhaps, be toned down is but a gentle method of expressing the order to strike the reform flag. This legislation should be obtained at once and acted on at once. Within 10 days Tweed will be released by a reversal in the Court of Appeals, and unless in the meantime an efficient remedy be given, and civil process holding him to bail be issued, he will be off to join company with Connolly and Sweeney. The latter could now be prosecuted through Ingersoll's assistance if we could have an honest prosecutor, and either plain unmistakable law or an honest court. It will not do to say that on the strength of Allen's and Folger's opinions the city has a right of action for the $6 million courthouse fraud. These opinions are probably unsound. All jurists of character will condemn them, and by they will be pronounced not law. It is only by just such a statute as has been drafted that the exigency can be met. If we had one more judge, there are easy methods of getting rid of the judgments given. The action against Ingersoll was actually abated before the judgment, and all the proceedings are consequently coram non judice and void. The Fields case rested on the void judgment in the Ingersoll case as its basis. Folger does not reason the matter, nor docs he rely on the Allen opinion by any means. It is on the void judgment that he relies. See my pamphlet, page 91. It would be easy to vacate the judgment in both those cases, dismiss the Ingersoll case for irregularity, and re-argue the Fields case. A judgment of affirmance might then follow in the latter, the basis of the former decision being taken away. But there is just one too many for us, and that one with singular harmony is found to be the minority representative whom these ring swindlers put in by a false count in this city. Point 1. More than 25 years ago I thought I saw that the corruption of parties must run to an intolerable excess before the victims of their malversation would be stirred to a revolutionary movement of sufficient force to check effectually the evil agencies in our government. I conjectured that the needed climax would not be reached in my lifetime, and hence my entire abstinence from participation in party politics. From this abstinence side arrived many personal advantages. I was being permitted to pass quietly along and down into the vale of years toward the close. Standing in no man's way, I had every man's good word, and received universal courtesy. Though indulging and freely expressing the most unpopular opinions, the whole class of unprincipled politicians, having in fact no opinions of their own, liked me all the better for my unfashionable impracticability. It gave a comforting assurance to every one of them that in no possible turn of events could I ever stand in his way. By courting he could use me, and yet have nothing to fear from me. This was my happy condition, when you broke in upon my seclusion in 1871. I cannot say that I had then any faith in the practicability of your attempt, or any other, to rescue popular interests from the process of strangulation by official villainy that was progressing. Folger was the judge to whom, doubtless, reference is here made. But I did not feel at liberty to say it was impossible, for I then held as now I hold. It doth become no man to nurse despair, but in the teeth of clenched antagonisms, to struggle for the worthiest till he die. So, on your summons I went in and helped you with all my might. The studies and observations of these 3 years, together with the actual progress of events, have produced a conviction in my mind that we have reached the climax, that a revolution is in movement, and that official depravity has reached its day of reconing. So even if you sleep, Perhaps I will not. The pronunciamento for the new administration in the form of an indictment as originally prepared ought perhaps to accompany this letter. Though it cost me more than ordinary trouble and effort, I never supposed that it would be accepted. But, as usual, I do my part. I prepared it. It is very much emasculated. Its value was infinitely beyond its adaptation to and sufficiency for the immediate business in hand. It pledged the new administration. After being made fully acceptable to the weak vessel who was to sign it, his secretary condemned it. It would displease our friends was his irresistible argument. In both of the great political parties our friends are the country's bitterest enemies. They exist in both parties in adequate numbers to suppress all efforts to any permanent good. This letter need not be answered. You are overrun with occupations, and with me there is no need of ceremony. It is only intended for yourself, and should not be made public. Still I do not enjoin secrecy. Yours truly, C.H. O'Connor. Governor Tilden. The governor in his message had anticipated Mr. O'Connor's appeal, and through his influence the requisite legislation was secured at that session. Could its importance and the uses it was expected to subserve have been anticipated by those immediately concerned, it is doubtful if it could have been carried. As it was, it encountered no formidable opposition. It was the most important measure, if judged by its immediate fruits, enacted by the legislature during the governor's administration. Footnote: Chapter 19 of Laws of 1875. Of the importance of these laws, Governor Tilden bears fervent testimony in a message to the legislature on the 10th of May. It is but just to the present legislature to say that the three bills which it adopted with great unanimity, providing judicial remedies against frauds affecting the public moneys or property, are of more value for the repression of the evils of municipal government than all the legislation which has taken place during the 29 years in which the mandate of the Constitution, in respect to municipal administration, has remained unexecuted. It is true they reach abuses only when extravagance and improvidence degenerate into bad faith or fraud, but they apply to every official of every city, as well as to all state, county, and town functionaries. They apply to every case in which a city official shall, with intent to defraud, wrongfully obtain, receive, convert, pay out, or dispose of any public moneys, funds, credits, or property. They apply to every case in which such an official shall, with like intent, by willfully paying, allowing, or auditing any false or unjust claim, or in any other manner or way whatever, aid or abet any other person in wrongfully obtaining, receiving, converting, paying out, or disposing of any public money, funds, credits, or property. They apply also to every person who, dealing with any official, shall, with intent to defraud, wrongfully obtain, receive, convert, pay out, or dispose of any such money, funds, credits, or property. They sweep away the complicated technicalities by which conviction for such offenses has hitherto been embarrassed or defeated. Public Writings and Speeches, Volume 2, page 122. End footnote. The feature of his message, however, which at the time produced, perhaps, the most profound impression, not only upon the governor's immediate constituents, but upon the whole nation, was that which related to the financial policy of the federal government. Till then, no prominent Democrat had ventured since the war to revive the financial traditions and policy which were still associated in the public mind with the historic triumphs of the Democratic Party. Wild and silly notions of repairing the waste of war and restoring the depressed energies of industry and commerce by unlimited issues of irredeemable currency had infected large sections of the country. A generation had grown up who had never seen or used any other money than a printed promise of the government, and it had become a widespread conviction among the aspiring politicians of both the great parties that the current of public opinion in favor of an inflated and irredeemable currency would overwhelm and destroy any public man who should attempt to stem it. No convention of either party in any state of the Union had yet risked the experiment. The active leaders of both had either avoided or yielded to the current. The governor had no toleration for such delusions, nor much for those who yielded to them. Of course he did not fail to avail himself of the first opportunity from the executive chair of branding them as delusions. The views presented by Mr. Tilden in this message possess an interest that is neither local nor transitory. They concern now and hereafter, as then, all who are charged with the responsibility of government. He has been heard to speak of this part of his first message as constituting a new and therefore unwritten chapter in the literature of finance. With reference to Mr. Chase's policy of raising money for the prosecution of the war by the forcible circulation of an irredeemable currency, the governor said, "There is no doubt that the issue of legal tenders during the Civil War hastened and greatly increased that inflation of prices which naturally resulted from the increased consumption and the waste caused by military operations, and from the diminished production occasioned by so large a withdrawal of workers from their ordinary industries. It is the nature of credit to be voluntary. It is founded on confidence. Credit, on compulsion, is a solecism, so that a forced loan of capital from all existing private creditors cannot but be costly. It was made, in this instance, on a security which bore no interest, an interest on which could only be represented in discount from its par value. It gave to the lender an agreement to pay, which, being instantly due on demand, started in its career a broken and dishonored promise. Every successive holder was left to conjecture when it would be redeemed by the issuer, how far it might be absorbed in the treasury receipts, whether it could still be paid out to some private creditor, at what loss it could be passed away in new purchases, on a market advancing rapidly and irregularly. Everybody was advised that the federal government, unwisely distrusting the intelligence and patriotism of the people, shrank from exercising its borrowing power, supplemented by its taxing power, that, instead of resorting at once to the whole capital of the country capable of being loaned, which forms a vast fund perhaps 30 or 40 times as large as the then existing currency, it chose to begin by debasing that comparatively insignificant part of circulating credits, creating fictitious prices for the commodities and services for which it was next to exchange its bonds, in an expenditure 10 times as large as the whole amount of the legal tenders it ventured to put afloat. No man could know how often or how much of legal tenders might be issued under possible exigencies of the future. It could not be wholly forgotten that such issues, made by our ancestors to sustain the victorious war for national independence, were never redeemed, while the public loans made for the same purposes were all paid. It was remembered that history affords other warning examples to the same effect. These elements of distrust were needlessly invoked. But the system stopped short of the logical completeness of the expedients of the French Convention in 1793. While it compelled the existing private creditor, or anybody who should grant a new credit, to accept payment in legal tenders, it did not assume to regulate the prices of commodities. The seller, therefore, gradually learned to represent the depreciation of the currency in the price of the article he exchanged for it. As compared with gold, the currency, during all the last year of the war, was depreciated to between 40 and 50 cents on the dollar, touching at its lowest point 35 cents on the dollar. It was not alone by the direct effect of the depreciation of the currency that prices were acted upon. Speculation was engendered. Political economy takes little account of the emotional and imaginative nature of man. In long periods, with numerous instances, the average, deduced as a law, may perhaps discard that element. But in a particular instance, or at a particular time, it is often very potent, and must be estimated in any calculation which aims at accuracy. After a period of rest, when the disposition to activity begins to revive, a slight circumstance often excites a speculation that becomes general. The opening of a new market, an apprehended deficiency in the supply of a commodity, any one of 1,000 circumstances, may, in a certain state of the public mind, be a spark to kindle a blaze of speculation throughout the commercial world. How much more, Then, might it have been expected that such a governmental policy would inspire and inflame the spirit of speculation? The effect was greatest during the process of a new issue of currency, or while it was anticipated. After the issue was completed, there was generally a subsidence, or a reaction. Mr. Tilden's own views of what would have been the true financial policy of our country during the war, and which, as we have already stated, he had in substance recommended to Mr. Stanton, are also set forth in this message. Governments, in times of public danger, he says, cannot be expected always to adhere to the maxims of economical science. The few, who would firmly trust to the wisest policy, will be often overborne by the advocates of popular expedients dictated by general alarm. If the federal government had paid out treasury notes not made a legal tender, in its own transactions whenever it was convenient, and redeemed them by the proceeds of loans and taxes on their presentation at a central point of commerce, and meanwhile had borrowed at the market rates for its bonds, secured by ample sinking funds, founded on taxation, and had supplemented such loans by all necessary taxes, the sacrifice would not have been half that required by the false system adopted. Perhaps the cost of the war would not have been half what it became. The fallacy lurking in many minds, and by which the army of inflationists have been largely recruited, that the quantity of the currency, even when it has become stationary and quiescent, creates by its direct action a state of prices proportionate to its quantity, is thus disposed of. The premium on gold fell from 185 in July, 1864, to 29 in May, 1865, or rather the currency rose from 35 cents to 77 cents in gold value, while the amount of the currency remained undiminished. The quantity of the currency in the hands of the public taking the aggregate of the legal tenders and the bank notes, and excluding all of both which are held by the Treasury or by the banks, is now larger than at any former period. The existence of such a quantity has not arrested the tendency to a general fall of prices. The present inconveniences in business, which it is proposed to remedy by a new issue of currency, have originated and gone on to their maturity, while the currency was being distended to its greatest volume. An excess beyond what is capable of being used for the business of society is now, for the first time, distinctly indicated. The movement of the crops in the last autumn, which requires something like 1/10 addition to the ordinary amount, created no stringency. The banks have voluntarily withdrawn some millions of their circulation. It is probable that the amount capable of being absorbed by the business of the country will continue to fall for a long period. In such a condition of business, of credit, and of the public temper, a new issue of currency would not cause a rise of prices, unless it were so excessive as to occasion speculative depreciation, or distrust of ultimate redemption. It could not reanimate the dead corpse of exhausted speculation. A period of quiescence must ordinarily precede a renewal of the spirit of adventurous enterprise. The distress now felt is incident to the continued fall of values, which is the descending part of the cycle through which they must pass after being forced up to an unnatural elevation. The want felt is a want of capital which the party does not own and has not the credit to borrow, not a lack of currency. It is caused by investments in enterprises which have turned out to be wholly or partially bad, or which give slow returns than were anticipated, by too much conversion of circulating capital in fixed capital, by excessive undertakings or engagements, induced by a reliance on a credit that was transient. In a period of falling prices, good property becomes less convertible. It loses its circulatory quality. It almost ceases to be a resource to obtain money. These inconveniences would not be removed if the government should put out legal tenders and take in a corresponding amount of bonds, or if a bank should deposit bonds and receive notes in exchange. Still, the individual distressed for the want of capital would have no additional means to buy or borrow these new issues, which the new owner would obtain only by paying for them. A diminution of the government bonds outstanding is a condition of the increase of legal tenders or bank notes. If an embarrassed person could obtain the government bond surrendered or deposited, He would be as much relieved by his power to dispose of them as he would by a power to dispose of the legal tenders or bank notes. His difficulty is that he is equally unable to obtain either. He has not the means to buy or the credit to borrow them. What he wants is something to make his bad investments good, his slow investments current, something to make his property convertible, to impart to it a circulating quality, as when there is a general rise of values under a speculative excitement, and everybody is disposed to buy, and everything finds a ready market. He wants something to create in others a disposition to buy, in order that he may be able to sell. This is what, in the present state of things, an increase of the currency will not do. It would not act mechanically on prices. It does not operate by physical means. It simply influences the minds of men. It induces them to buy, and, in the effort to do so, they bid up prices. It is only when the minds of men are disposed to receive an impulse towards buying that such an effect is produced. When speculators go into the market to influence others to buy, in order that they may sell, the conference usually ends in a fall. Even when speculators go into the market to sell on an event expected to cause a rise, the result is commonly a fall. Everybody cannot get out at once, at the expense of others. The amount of currency required by the needs of business is not to be decided by former experience. There is no doubt that, on the first issue of legal tenders, they were largely substituted for other forms of credit. A single case will illustrate. The sudden rise in prices enabled the farmer to become the owner of the floating capital, on which his next year's dealings with the country merchants were to be carried on. The habits of business change to adapt themselves to new conditions. It is possible that the government might cautiously follow the tendencies of trade, and retire each clearly ascertained surplus without doing any harm. But a withdrawal of any considerable portion of the amount required at the season of the year which creates the largest demand would produce serious and unnecessary distress. The adoption of a system which should threaten such a result would be very mischievous. The federal government is bound to redeem every portion of its issues which the public do not wish to use. Having assumed to monopolize the supply of currency and enacted exclusions against everybody else, it is bound to furnish all which the wants of business require. The case is as if the government should undertake to monopolize the supply of lake propellers or canal boats to bring grain to market. If it should not furnish enough, the derangement of business and the distress of producers and consumers would be intolerable. While securing redemption, the government should organize a system which passively allows the volume of circulating credits to ebb and flow, according to the ever-changing wants of business. It should imitate as closely as possible the natural laws of trade which it has superseded by artificial contrivances. He thus states the conditions upon which, in his judgment, the federal government might and should resume, and upon which it ultimately did resume without the slightest practical difficulty. The ability of the federal government to resume specie payments is thus simply a question of its command of resources to pay such portions of the circulating credits it has issued as the public, not wishing to use, may return upon it for redemption. The amount to be paid cannot be considered large, in comparison with its financial operations. It has the taxing power, and by reducing its expenditure could accumulate an adequate surplus. It has the borrowing power and good credit. It can make permanent loans and pay the treasury notes which are returned for redemption. It can convert them or fund them into interest-bearing securities. In that case they would cease to be currency, and would take their place among investments like national, state, municipal, railroad, or other corporate bonds, or any of the numerous forms of moneyed securities, of which many thousand millions are held in our country. The circulatory quality, in securities of equal general credit, is chiefly a question of the rate of interest they bear. The amount of coin necessary for resumption is, first, an adequate reserve to meet the demand for exportation, for which the Treasury would become the universal reservoir, and, second, a surplus sufficient fully to assure the people that the treasury supply would not be exhausted. The power to command coin as the owner of foreign bills of exchange, or in other forms, would, to a large extent, be equivalent to possessing coin. Beyond such an amount of coin, the question is simply a question of capital. The exact time of actual resumption, the process, the specific measures, the discrete preparations, these are business questions to be dealt with, in view of the state of trade and of credit operations in our own country, the course of foreign commerce, and the condition of the exchanges with other nations, the currents of the precious metals, and the stocks from which a supply would flow without undue disturbance of the markets of other countries. These are matters of detail, to be studied on the facts and figures. They belong to the domain of practical administrative statesmanship. The message closes with an appeal to the people which is as timely today as when it was made, and which, as years roll on, is likely to deserve increasing rather than diminishing attention. For nearly a generation the controversies which led to fratricidal conflict have drawn away the attention of the people from the questions of administration, which involve every interest and duty of good government. The culture, the training, and the practice of our people in the ordinary conduct of public affairs have been falling into disuse. Meanwhile, the primitive simplicity of institutions and of society in which government was little felt, and could be neglected with comparative impunity, has been passing away. If public necessities must wring so much from the earnings of individuals, taxation must become scientific. In our new condition, all the problems of administration have become more difficult. They call for more intellect and more knowledge of the experience of other countries. They need to become the engrossing theme of the public thought in the discussion of the press, and in the competition of parties, which is the process of free institutions. This message was presented to the legislature on the 5th day of January, 1875. On the 19th of March, and as soon as Governor Tilden had secured from the legislature such additional remedies for official delinquencies as were requisite for his purpose, and to which reference has already been made, he invited the attention of the legislature, in a special message, to the mismanagement of the canals. The canal ring embraced, as the name implies, about an equal proportion of both political parties. It consisted of men who had become wealthy by plundering the state as contractors, and of political parasites who were indebted to them for their positions, and who as agents of the state certified their work, audited and paid their bills. The master spirits of this ring at the time of Tilden's accession to the governorship were Messrs. Denison and Belden, of Syracuse. Denison trained and traded with the Democrats, Belden with the Republicans. In this way they had a key to the pantry of every administration, and between them both, like Jack Spratt and his wife, they licked the platter of both parties clean. Denison was a good-natured and festive creature, who stepped to the front when the Democrats were in power, while his partner, Belden, was a cool-headed and capable man of business, strictly temperate in his habits and punctual in his attendance upon the services of his church. He appeared on the stage when the Republicans prevailed. It used to be said of the firm that Denison furnished the rum and the democracy, and Belden the hypocrisy and the republicanism. Jarvis Lord and Will R. Johnson, who at this time occupied seats in the legislature, and George D. Lord, the son of Jarvis, who had been in the legislature and was soon to be indicted for bribery, were also extensive canal contractors, and more or less closely associated for ring purposes with Denison and Belden. The legislature contained many more members who were, some partially and others entirely, indebted for their seats to these men. Several, if not all, of the state officers were under like obligations of fealty. Mr. Tilden had been familiar for years with their power and methods of operation, for he had frequently tried conclusions with them, in which, when not defeated, his victories cost nearly if not quite all they were worth. Knowing the power of the adversary with which he proposed to do battle, and that it would not do to make any charge which he was not prepared to substantiate and maintain against all comers. He had begun to collect the material for this message soon after his election. He employed Mr. L. Sweet, a civil engineer, whose professional and personal character had won his confidence, to visit those portions of the canal upon which contract work had been done during the 5 or 6 preceding years, and instructed him to take down sufficient of the walls in the prism of all the canals to ascertain the dimensions and character of their work, and then to visit the auditor's office to compare the work done with the work required by their contracts. The result of this investigation and comparison were laid before the governor at or very soon after his inauguration, but without a suspicion of what had been going on, or the purpose of it, gaining currency outside of the executive chamber. With these reports in his hand, the governor prepared his message, which, when presented by his private secretary, was equally a surprise to the legislature and the public. In it he set forth in detail the fraudulent processes by which for an indefinite period of years the state had been plundered, its agents debauched, its politics demoralized, and its credit imperiled. End of Chapter 10, Part 1.